Hanging, drawing, and quartering was a specific punishment. It was for a specific crime. That crime was high treason. In the medieval world, nothing was worse. To understand the punishment, you have to understand the crime. And to understand the crime, you have to understand their world. Today we think of treason as betraying your country. You're selling secrets to an enemy, fighting for a foreign power. It's a political crime. In medieval England, it was much more than that. It was personal, it was spiritual. It was an attack on the very fabric of reality. The king was not just a leader, he was chosen by God. He was God's representative on earth, his body was sacred, but he had two bodies. There was the king's physical body, the man who ate and slept and could get sick. Then there was the body politic. This was the kingdom itself, the land, the people, the law, the order. The king's physical body and the body politic were seen as one and the same. So an attack on the king was an attack on the kingdom. It was an attack on the people. And because the king was chosen by God, it was an attack on God himself. And it was a sin of the highest order. It was like trying to kill God. It was an attempt to turn the world upside down and create chaos. This crime needed a formal definition. For a long time, what counted as treason was vague. Though kings could accuse their enemies of treason for almost anything. This created instability. So, in 1351, King Edward III enacted the Treason Act. This law laid out exactly what high treason was. It was remarkably clear. One part of the act was about compassing or imagining the king's death. This is the most famous part. Just thinking about it, planning it was as bad as doing it. If he wrote a letter suggesting the king should die, that was treason. If he spoke with friends about how to get rid of him, that was treason. The thought itself was the crime because it violated the sacred nature of the king. Another part was about violating the king's wife, his eldest unmarried daughter, or the wife of his heir. This wasn't about sex, it was about bloodlines. The royal succession had to be pure. Any doubt about the legitimacy of the next king could lead to civil war. An affair with the queen wasn't just an affair, it was an act that threatened the stability of the entire realm. It was treason. Levying war against the king was also high treason. This was more straightforward. Raising an army to overthrow him was a direct assault on his authority. Giving aid and comfort to the king's enemies fell under this too. If France was at war with England and you sold them supplies or gave them information, you were a traitor. There were also sections on counterfeiting the king's money or his official seal. This seems like a financial crime to us. To them, it was an attack on the king's sovereignty. The king's image was on the coin. His seal authenticated official documents. To fake them was to fake his authority. You were undermining the very trust that held the kingdom together. Finally, killing the Lord Chancellor or one of the king's judges while they were in their roles was treason. These men were the king's direct representatives. They dispensed his justice. To kill them was to attack the king's law itself. So you can see, high treason was a crime against the entire order of the world. It was a personal betrayal of a man, a political betrayal of a country, and a spiritual betrayal of God. A normal execution wouldn't do. A simple beheading was for nobles who committed regular crimes. A simple hanging was for common thieves. For a crime that sought to tear the kingdom apart, the punishment had to reflect that. It couldn't just kill the traitor. It had to destroy him. It had to annihilate his body, his memory, and his soul. It had to be a spectacle. It had to be a warning. The punishment had to be so terrible that no one would dare imagine the king's death ever again. The punishment was a form of theater. Every part of it was symbolic. Every action had a meaning. It was designed to address each part of the treason. The traitor had betrayed his king, his country, and his God. So the state would take his body, his dignity, and his chance at a proper Christian burial. The punishment was not just about causing pain, it was about sending a message, and that message was written in blood and suffering. It was the ultimate expression of the state's power. It showed everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest lord, what happened when you challenged the man God put on the throne. The punishment did not begin at the gallows. It began the moment the sentence was passed. From that point on, the condemned man was no longer treated as a human being. He was a piece of property for the state to make an example of. The execution itself was the final act of a long, drawn-out play of humiliation and terror. The first act was the procession. The journey from the prison to the place of execution was a crucial part of the ritual. It was not a quick trip. It was a slow public spectacle designed for maximum shame. The most famous starting point was the Tower of London. The tower was not just a prison, it was a symbol of royal power. To be dragged from its walls was to be cast out from the king's authority in the most dramatic way possible. The traitor was not allowed to walk. He was not given the dignity of a cart. He was tied to a hurdle. The hurdle was a simple wooden frame, like a fence panel or a ladder, that was laid flat on the ground. The prisoner was strapped to it, often face up. Then horses were attached, and the hurdle was dragged through the streets. This was not a smooth ride. The streets of medieval London were not paved. They were dirt and cobblestone, covered in filth. Garbage, animal waste, and sewage filled the roads. The man on the hurdle was dragged through all of it. The stones would cut his back and head. The filth would cover him. This was the first stage of his dehumanization. And he was being treated like refuse, dragged through refuse. The journey was intentionally long. It would wind through the most populated parts of the city. The route from the Tower to Tyburn, a common execution site, was several miles long. It could take hours. This gave everyone a chance to see the traitor, and the crowds were a huge part of the event. Executions were major public events. People would take the day off work, street vendors sold food and beer. It was a form of entertainment, but it was also a civic duty. It was a chance for the public to show their loyalty to the king by scorning his enemy. The crowd would line the streets, shouting insults, spitting, and throwing things at the condemned man. They might throw mud, rotten fruit, or rocks. It was a terrifying gauntlet of public hatred. Imagine being that man on the hurdle. You are in pain. You are covered in filth. And for hours you are dragged past thousands of screaming faces, people you might have known, people who now see you as a monster. There was no escape from their judgment. This was part of the psychological torture. The state was demonstrating that the traitor had not only lost the king's favor, but the favor of all his countrymen. He was utterly alone. Sometimes the procession would make stops. It might pause at significant locations, perhaps places where the traitor had committed his crimes. At each stop, he might be publicly shamed again. A priest might call on him to confess his sins. A herald might read out his crimes for the crowd to hear. This was all carefully orchestrated. The authorities wanted the traitor to arrive at the gallows broken, not just physically, but mentally. They wanted him to be a pathetic, wretched figure. A defiant traitor was dangerous. A broken one was a powerful warning. The sound of the procession would announce its arrival. A bell might be rung. The shouts of the crowd and the clatter of the guards' horses would echo through the streets. It was a slow-moving parade of death, and at the end of it the gallows waited. The destination was often a place with a fearsome reputation, like Tyburn or Smithfield. These places were outside the main city walls, places associated with death and disposal. Arriving there after hours of torment, the traitor would see the structure where his life would end in the most horrific way imaginable. He would see the executioner, the priest, and the massive expectant crowd. The procession was not just a way to get the prisoner from point A to point B, it was a vital part of the punishment. It stripped the traitor of his identity. It turned him from a man into a symbol of betrayal. It allowed society to collectively purge itself of the threat he represented. By the time he reached the scaffold, he had already suffered a kind of social death. The physical death was yet to come. After the long, humiliating journey, the traitor arrived at the place of execution. This was the main event. Here, the full, brutal symbolism of the punishment would be carried out. The crowd, which had followed the procession, would press in close. They wanted to see everything. The state wanted them to see everything. This was the core of the warning. Every step was deliberate. Every action was steeped in meaning. The execution had three main parts: the hanging, the drawing, and the quartering. The first part was the hanging. This was not the kind of hanging we think of today, with a long drop designed to snap the neck and cause instant death. That would have been a mercy, and mercy was not the point. This was short drop hanging. The traitor would be made to climb a ladder, a rope placed around his neck, and then the ladder would be turned over or pulled away. He would drop only a short distance. The goal was strangulation. The man would choke, his face turning purple, his body convulsing. He would struggle for air, fighting against the rope. But he was not meant to die. The executioner was skilled. He knew exactly how long to let the man hang. The traitor was to be brought to the very edge of death, to lose consciousness, but to be cut down while he was still alive. The law specified he be hanged by the neck and cut down alive. While still breathing, perhaps semi-conscious, he was taken down and stripped naked. He was laid on a block or a table. Now, the second, most gruesome part of the sentence began the drawing. This is where the term can be confusing. Some say drawing referred to being drawn to the gallows on the hurdle. But in the context of the sentence hanged, drawn, and quartered, it meant disembowelment. The executioner, often wearing a mask or hood, would take a sharp knife. He would make a long incision across the man's abdomen. The traitor was supposed to be alive to see this. He was supposed to witness his own mutilation. The executioner would reach into the body cavity and pull out the intestines, the liver, the stomach. These were his entrails, his bowels. In medieval belief, the bowels were the seat of passion and secrets. By pulling them out and showing them to the crowd, the state was symbolically exposing the traitor's inner corruption and evil. What happened next was even more horrific. The organs were often thrown into a fire that had been prepared nearby. The man on the table could see and smell his own insides burning. In some accounts, the executioner would go for the heart last. He would cut it out of the chest cavity. He would hold it up for the crowd to see. Sometimes he would shout, "Behold the heart of a traitor." This was the ultimate violation. The heart was seen as the source of life and loyalty. By destroying it, the state was destroying the very essence of the man. Only after this horrific process of evisceration was the man finally killed. The final act of the execution itself was beheading. The head was severed from the body with an axe or a large knife. This was the final, definitive end to his life. But the punishment of the body was not over. The third part was the quartering. The headless, disemboweled corpse was then dismembered. It was cut into 4 pieces. This was usually done by chopping off the arms and legs. Sometimes horses were tied to the limbs and made to run in opposite directions, literally tearing the body apart. This entire sequence was a systematic destruction of the human form. The man was hanged to represent the death of a common criminal. He was disemboweled, a punishment that was sometimes inflicted on saints in reverse, to show his utter damnation. He was beheaded, a punishment usually reserved for the nobility, perhaps to acknowledge the high status of his crime. And he was cut into pieces to show that he was no longer a whole person, no longer part of the community of man. He was just meat. The tools were simple and brutal. Sharp knives, a heavy axe, a sturdy rope, a fire. The executioner was a professional, paid by the state. He had to be strong and have a steady hand. A botched execution was a disaster. It could turn the crowd's anger from the prisoner to the executioner. They expected a certain level of competence in the horror. For the people watching, this was a complex experience. It was frightening. It was a stark reminder of what happened to enemies of the state. But it was also a form of justice. They believed the traitor deserved this. His crime was so great that it had threatened them all. This terrible ritual was, in their eyes, a way of cleansing the community and restoring the natural order that the traitor had tried to destroy. It was justice as they understood it. The traitor's death was not the end of his punishment. In many ways, what happened after the execution was just as important as the execution itself. The goal was not just to kill the man, but to erase his memory, dishonor his family, and extend his punishment into the afterlife. The aftermath was a powerful and enduring part of the warning. After the body was quartered, the 5 pieces, the 4 limbs, and the headcraft were prepared for public display. They couldn't just be nailed up. They would rot too quickly, so they were parboiled, often in a large cauldron of water, seasoned with salt and cumin. This process cooked the flesh, which helped to preserve it. It also made it less appealing to scavenging birds. After boiling, the parts were coated in tar. The tar acted as a final preservative, protecting the flesh from the elements and giving it a dark, menacing appearance. Now, the pieces were ready to be distributed. The head was the most important part. It was the seat of identity. It was what people recognized. The traitor's head was given the most prominent place of display. For centuries, the most famous spot was on a spike above the gatehouse of London Bridge. London Bridge was the main entry point into the city from the south. Anyone entering or leaving London would have to pass beneath the row of decaying, tarred heads. It was a constant, grim reminder of the price of treason. The heads would stay there for years, weathering in the sun and rain, until they fell apart or were replaced by the head of a new traitor. There was even an official position, the keeper of the heads, whose job it was to manage this gruesome display. Seeing the faces of men you might have known, or men whose names were famous, was a powerful deterrent. The other 4 parts of the body, the quarters, were sent to different parts of the kingdom. They were usually sent to major cities, often places that had some connection to the traitor or his rebellion. A quarter might be sent to York in the north, Bristol in the west, and so on. They would be displayed on the city gates or in other public places. The message was clear. The king's justice was not limited to London. His reach was everywhere. No corner of the realm was safe for his enemies. It was a way of broadcasting the execution to the entire country. A citizen in a distant town who had only heard rumors of the treason could now see a piece of the traitor's body with his own eyes. It made the threat real and immediate. This dismemberment and display had a profound religious meaning as well. In Christian theology, a proper burial was essential. The body was supposed to be buried whole, in consecrated ground, to await resurrection on Judgment Day. By scattering the traitor's body across the country, the state was denying him this. He could not have a funeral, his family could not mourn him, and, in the popular imagination, he could not be made whole again to face his maker. It was a punishment that aimed for eternal damnation. The consequences for the traitor's family were also devastating. The punishment was designed to destroy not just the man, but his entire lineage. When a man was convicted of high treason, he suffered what was called an attainder. This meant his blood was legally corrupted. He could no longer own property. He could not pass on any inheritance to his children. All of his lands, his titles, and his wealth were forfeit to the crown. His family was instantly stripped of everything. They would be thrown out of their home, left with nothing. They were socially ruined. The name of a traitor was a stain that was difficult to wash away. The children and wife of the condemned man would live with the shame for the rest of their lives. In this way, the punishment echoed through generations. The display of the bodies, the denial of burial, and the destruction of the family line were all calculated. They were meant to be the final, crushing blows of the state's power. The traitor was not just killed, he was unmade. His body was disassembled, his soul was endangered, his property was seized, his family was disgraced. His name was made infamous. The aftermath of the execution ensured that the message of his terrible end would linger long after the blood on the scaffold had dried. The practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering was not just a brief, barbaric episode of the Middle Ages. It was the law of the land in England for over 500 years. It was used against famous figures like the Scottish hero William Wallace in 1305. It was the sentence handed down to Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators in the Gunpowder Plot of 1606. It continued to be used well into the 18th century, but societies change. Ideas about justice, humanity, and the role of government evolve. The world that had created this punishment, a world of divine kings and a deeply symbolic religious view of the state, began to fade. The forces that brought about its end were gradual but powerful. A major shift came with the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers like John Locke and Cesare Beccaria began to challenge traditional ideas about power and punishment. They argued for reason, for human rights, and for laws that were rational and humane, not just cruel and vengeful. Beccaria, in his famous work on crimes and punishments, argued that the severity of a punishment should not go beyond what was necessary for deterrence. He called torturous and cruel executions barbaric and ineffective. These ideas began to circulate among the educated classes. The public spectacle of execution started to be seen in a different light. What was once a righteous display of justice began to look like a grotesque and savage carnival of death. The crowds at executions sometimes became unruly. They might sympathize with the condemned, seeing them as martyrs rather than villains. Instead of reinforcing state power, a botched or particularly cruel execution could lead to riots and criticism of the government. The state started to lose control of the message. Public tastes were changing too. A growing middle class valued order, decency, and refinement. The brutal, visceral world of public executions felt like a relic from a less civilized time. Newspapers began to report on executions, and while some accounts were sensational, others were critical of the cruelty involved. The law itself began to slowly change. Judges and juries became more reluctant to hand down the full sentence. Often, the king would grant a partial reprieve as an act of mercy. For example, a nobleman convicted of treason might be graciously allowed a simple beheading instead of the full ordeal. Over time, the most brutal parts of the sentence were often carried out after the prisoner was already dead. The hanging would be allowed to cause death, and the disembowelment and quartering would become a posthumous ritual. This maintained the symbolic form of the punishment without the extreme cruelty of torturing a living person. The last man to be sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered was a Chartist leader in 1839, but the sentence was commuted to transportation. The last time the punishment was actually carried out in a modified form was in 1817 on 3 men convicted of treason. They were hanged until dead, then beheaded. Formal legal change came in the 19th century. The Treason Act of 1814 officially changed the sentence. It allowed the king to substitute beheading for the full sentence. It also stipulated that the disembowelment and quartering were to be done after the person was dead. This was a major step away from the original intent of the punishment as a form of prolonged torture. Finally, in 1870, the Forfeiture Act was passed. This act abolished the practice of attainder, which stripped a traitor's family of their property and rights. It was a recognition that a person's family should not be punished for their crimes. The same year, the full sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was formally removed from the law books. Treason was still a capital crime, but the punishment was now to be a simple hanging. The era of the gruesome spectacle was officially over. Looking back, hanging, drawing, and quartering tells us a great deal about the society that practiced it. It shows a world where power was absolute and personal, centered on the physical body of the monarch. It reveals a deep-seated fear of chaos and a belief that extreme threats required an extreme response. It was a punishment born from a world where symbolism mattered as much as life itself, and where justice had to be seen, felt, and smelled by everyone. The end of this practice marks a fundamental shift in how we see ourselves, our government, and the very meaning of justice. It was the end of a world where a traitor's body was a canvas on which the state could paint its most terrifying message.